Let's meet our distinguished first speaker, Elisa Goldberg. Elisa knows ODI very well through her role as Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy at Global Affairs Canada. You will hear directly from her about Canada's commitment on this important cause. Elisa will be speaking in both English and French, and I'll attempt to give her the floor in French. Elisa, le Canada montre la voie dans la quête à l'égalité des sexes et la promotion des droits des femmes. Vos engagements pour faire progresser la participation égale des femmes à la prise de décision, à soutenir les femmes et les filles pour qu'elles réalisent pleinement leurs droits, et pour réduire les inégalités entre les sexes dans l'accès et le contrôle des ressources et des avantages du développement, sont un exemple clair à suivre pour tous. C'est un privilège de pouvoir collaborer avec vous pour cette importante conversation aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup d'avoir accepté d'ouvrir ce débat. Elisa, c'est un plaisir.
Merci, merci infiniment, Sarah. Comme toujours, je suis ravie de soyez avec vous sur une panel pour une conversation si importante. Tout d'abord, félicitations pour l'anniversaire de ODI. Sarah, as always, it's great to be with you and to engage with ODI on such an important event. Global Affairs Canada has had a very long and positive engagement with ODI. You've always been at the vanguard of evidence-based knowledge to inform decision makers so that we can try to drive positive change, most recently in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, but collaboration on humanitarian affairs, on securing better protection for civilians in armed conflict, on the socioeconomic implications of development, and on financing for development. These are all areas where ODI continues to make significant and important contributions so that we can collectively achieve our objectives to enhance sustainable development. It's a real pleasure to be part of these anniversary celebrations with a group of such inspiring people, particularly the up-and-coming thought leaders that you've invited to engage in this conversation. I'm looking forward to what is undoubtedly going to be a very productive day ahead of us. Aujourd'hui marque à la fois la Journée internationale des droits de la personne, y compris le dernier jour des 16 jours d'activisme contre la violence basée sur le genre. Alors, quel moment opportun pour discuter du chemin parcouru depuis l'adoption de la déclaration et du programme d'action du Pékin il y avait 5 ans, et comment poursuivre ces efforts vers une véritable égalité pour plus de la moitié de la population humaine. C'est sûr qu'en vivant maintenant, aucun doute, un moment conséquent et quand même unique dans une génération. La portée et l'ampleur de la COVID-19 sont à la fois sans précédent dans notre temps moderne et un test pour chaque individu, chaque communauté et chaque pays et organisation internationale. Women and girls have been amongst those most impacted as a result of the pandemic and its many consequences. Certainly, it's exacerbated existing inequalities across the globe. Women and girls are impacted disproportionately in terms of health, socioeconomic outcomes, and some of them are going to undoubtedly have long-term repercussions. We think of this in particular as it relates to nutrition, as it relates to the inability to access education, and I would say also the implications when we think about what the path to recovery will look like in different jurisdictions. This is a moment where we're also seeing women losing ground in access to resources, access to space in the workplace, and the opportunity to have a living. So I think as we reflect together on what a pathway, an effective pathway looks like for the recovery, there's a real unique opportunity for us to champion a bold, intersectional feminist approach, one that can support innovation and that can also be transformational in addressing systemic and persistent barriers for those that are most often marginalized or discriminated against. And I think today's discussion will be a really important contribution to achieving that objective. As Sarah mentioned, Canada has been an ardent advocate for gender equality, inclusion, and the empowerment of women and girls in a context of an effectively functioning international rules-based system. We believe that advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in all their diversity is the most effective way to eliminate poverty, to create lasting peace, and to achieve sustainable development. These are issues that Canada has championed for a very long time. What makes our work in recent years different is the emphasis on transformational change and on intersectionality, and the extent to which we've been seeking to pursue this across all of our assets of foreign policy. In the context of the current pandemic, I think the appropriateness of this focus and these priorities has only been further reinforced. As the thought leadership that we've sought to deliver through the pursuit of the feminist foreign policy has been pursued through our diplomatic efforts, trade, and international assistance actions. We've certainly been a loud and consistent advocate that gender equality plus considerations be applied across all COVID-19 related international discussions and decision making. This reflects our commitment pre-pandemic to push for gender responsive approaches and gender equality considerations to be integrated as part of the international agenda at consequential meetings, whether that be at the UN, the G7, the G20, the OECD, or in many other forums, including NATO. In terms of programming, since 2017, Canada has become the top OECD donor in regards to aid and support of gender equality and women's empowerment. For example, through our Women's Voice and Leadership program, we support local women's organizations. During the pandemic, the partners that we've supported through this program demonstrated their ability to shift in real time, move their funding to support and respond to the crisis, ensuring a feminist approach to activities at the grassroots level. The flexibility of our funding model was key to enabling that. An example in Haiti, for instance, where the local Women's Voice and Leadership Program partners have been working alongside the government and local media to create and adopt a gender-sensitive communication campaign and to promote prevention measures to stop the spread of COVID-19 and domestic violence. And they've also worked on a new hotline for victims of gender-based violence in the current context. Sur la scène internationale, nous sommes également fiers de co-diriger la coalition d'action sur le mouvement et le leadership féministe du Forum Génération Égalité avec nos partenaires de Malawi, du Pays-Bas, ainsi que plusieurs partenaires de la société civile et des organisations internationales, y compris des organisations dirigées par des jeunes. Convoqué par ONU Femmes, le Forum Génération Égalité est une opportunité unique d'accélérer le progrès sur l'égalité des genres, notamment par le baïs des actions qui rendront les organisations et les mouvements des femmes plus forts, plus résilientes, plus stables et j'espère aussi mieux soutenus dans la conjoncture difficile actuelle. L'accent mis sur le forum sur l'inclusion des adolescents et les jeunes femmes au sein de chaque coalition d'action et à toutes les étapes est un excellent exemple de la manière dont nous devrions nous intégrer la participation des adolescents et les jeunes femmes dans tous les forums internationaux. And this is why we're here today, to hear from a wide variety of experts and advocates on how we can work better together to affect the kind of change that we want to see, to hear from a new generation of thought leaders, what are their ideas and expectations around how we can shape a more equal and inclusive future together. So with that said, thanks again, Sarah. I'm looking forward to the dialogue today. I'm eager to hear from you and all of our partners on how we can accelerate progress on gender equality and support the empowerment of women and girls in all of their diversity. Merci infiniment.
Merci à vous, Elisa. So many thanks for your very inspiring words. What a brilliant framing for the rest of the conversations. And thanks also for your very generous words on ODI. I think, as you say, progress on women's rights is really a test for all of us. And it's a test that we can't fail. So let's try and make sure that we can use today to, further identify the pathways you refer to and pathways on which Canada has already shown so much leadership that we can build on. But now I'm delighted to hand over to ODI's Director of Gender Equality and Social Inclusion, Caroline Harper, who will be moderating our first panel on preventing violence. Caroline is an anthropologist with more than 30 years of experience in research, in policy analysis and advisory work. And actually, she is an expert herself on gender norms and norm change. So I'm sure we'll be listening to a very interesting discussion with the great panel that she will be moderating. But before I hand over to Caroline, let me just remind you that we will be all meeting back in the plenary room at 3:30 GMT. The plenary link has been posted in the chat, will be posted in the chat right now. Over to you, Caroline.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. And I know that the panel the first panel for this session are all online and will shortly be speaking to you. Before that happens, I wanted to try and frame up the day. And I'm going to be sharing just a couple of PowerPoints with you to help us to position ourselves and what we're talking about. So let me just set that up and then I will start. So as we know, 2020 was a very important and is a very important year for gender equality, the 25th anniversary since Beijing. But COVID, of course, forced a change of track for all of us. All of those meetings didn't happen. However, we felt it was really important to look back over time and to see what changes have happened over the last 25 years. And if we can be hopeful about change in the future, we have encountered enormous challenges, setbacks, backlash over the last 3 or 4 years in particular. And sometimes it does feel like we're going backwards. And yesterday, as this slide shows you, we were delighted to launch a new publication on gender, power and progress, looking at how norms change. And on a very positive note, we certainly did find that we have made and we continue to make progress, but change is long and hard, it's not linear, and 25 years is actually a relatively short time frame. Substantial change, of course, takes generations, but we do feel there's reason to be optimistic. And I wanted to share with you this conceptual framework that we developed. And we are very much talking about gender norms because this is at the center of gender equality. And until norms change, we will not have sustainable change. If you just look at the bottom of this chart, this starts with the maintainers of norms. These include sanctions and rewards, sanctions such as violence and ostracism, and rewards such as status and inclusion. These hold norms in place and they are very effective. Moving upwards, we see systemic barriers which compound discrimination and make change for certain communities harder than for others. And the patriarchal breaks in the next step are often invisible, and they exist in the institutions of society as well as in people's minds, in their hearts and their behaviours. Very importantly, individuals create and maintain institutions and reenact within them many of the same norms that shape their personal lives. So changing individual hearts and minds is tied up to changing institutions and structures of power. After all, these structures, such as legal systems, are made by fallible human beings. At this level, there exists a web of norms which include intersectional issues and which mean that action for change is not a one-size-fits-all. And these norms are enacted by what people say and what they do. When women enter parliament, but are not given jobs in finance and security because these are men's jobs. When politicians or the media welcome women MPs, but go on to speak over them, patronize them in their language, or be more concerned about what they wear than what they say. And when public figures receive anonymous and deeply misogynistic and violent social media attacks, which reveal what people really think, but which of course they won't say. When girls enter school and are told to sit at the back of the classroom, when women suffer sexual harassment in the workplace, and when doctors patronize their female patients. These are invisible norms institutionalized in formal structures. Taken as a whole, they're highly costly to society and they prevent progress. The forces for change, that upward arrow, cuts through all of these boundaries, and much of the conversation we'll have today are about these forces for change. The effects of change action scatter throughout, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unpredictably. And at the very top, we can see that a change norm can deliver more change. A girl in school, a woman politician, a woman in decent work. These individuals and their communities spread new ways of doing and being, and they reform institutions. It is this multiplying effect which enables us to be more optimistic about change speeding up. This is both as we understand more about actions which foster change and as we observe empowered actors taking actions. So in this conference today, we focus on one force for change, that is women's political voice, and one sanction and brake on change, and that is violence against women and girls and people of other genders. These two foci will give us perspective on how norm change happens, what actions need to be taken, and what has happened over the past 25 years. So in the first section, we'll focus on gender-based violence. This remains a critical barrier to progress. We know it keeps children out of school, women out of the workplace, compromises freedom of movement, and is endemic within domestic settings. Large-scale actions to prevent violence through the enactment and delivery of policies and services can be critical, but not when their implementation is weak. And we must also change attitudes and behaviours, what people think and what they do. So we're going to unpack what would enable change and what are the blocks to change and what are the actions for a post-2020 agenda. So I'm delighted to introduce the panel. Poonam, who's Executive Director of the Population Foundation of India in New Delhi, to pick up the conversation. Welcome, Poonam. Thank you, for joining us. I know your work very well. It's hugely influential. We're talking about different actions at different levels to combat gender-based violence. And Poonam has more than 40 years of experience working on issues around gender equality and with the Population Foundation, which is a leading think tank. Poonam, we'd love to hear from you about how communication strategies have led to changes in gender-based violence, especially in India.
So let me just quickly set the stage. Women and girls in India continue to be born into a social system that is steeped in inequality and discrimination. And the continuing increase of violence against women and girls is an indication of the deep-rooted and persistent patriarchal gender norms. For example, in a national survey done by the government of India jointly suggests that 30% of women in India in the age group 15 to 49 have experienced physical violence. These figures are a reflection of the structural institution inequality and the reality of a majority of the Indian women across class, caste, and income levels. So men and women, on the one hand, the deep-rooted cause of gender discrimination and violence needs to be addressed both at a systematic and institutional level, but also at an individual and collective level. And that's where social norms and behavior change comes in. And men and women together need to ensure equality, respect, dignity. So normative change at a societal level, while difficult, is not impossible, is what I'd like to say based on experience in India and other countries, using social and behavior change gender norms and strategies such as these social behavior change and communications programs that reach especially young people and make concerted efforts to improve women's lives are critical if we are to live up to our commitments to women and girls when we come to Beijing +25. So while infrastructure and service availability are critical, even the best policies and programs will not reach their fullest impact if we do not work on the intra and gender norms. Social and behavior change communication, SBCC, is used as an approach across all of Population Foundation of India's programs, recognizing that social norms drive individual behavior and action. So we use integrated voice response, television serial, chatbots, reaching out to women and men and young people to inform and empower them. Now, let me just say that what has been very critical about the SBCC, especially using entertainment, education, you're likely, and you do reach both men and women and young people at the same time. You can do that. And that's the experience in India, Brazil, Mexico, and the Great Soul City program in South Africa. So second, apart from using these where it leads to communication amongst young and old, it can lead to communication amongst couples, and that was clearly the experience of Population Foundation of India's program in Hindi, Main Kuch Bhi Kar Sakti Hu, and in English, I, a Woman Can Achieve Anything. Especially, we were stunned actually in the evaluation of the first season, where 52 episodes showed significant changes in attitudes towards domestic violence amongst audience in its first season. And by engaging audience, entertaining, and on points of messaging, we were able to challenge ideas like gender-based violence that led to a 20% point decrease in acceptability of domestic violence amongst men and women. You know, much of the focus in the first for decades has been on working with women when we talk about gender-based violence. But we cannot not address men. And there has been discomfort by the feminists, many of us who work on women's issues. And I'd be very, I'm dying to hear Gary Barker on this, whose leading work in male engagement. Well, in my experience, it shows, my experience has been that if you address only women, you are not going to be able to deal with the issue of GBV, and men get very antagonized when women do make advances, especially on GBV, and collective action too is something that is feared by not just feared by men, but there is a backlash. So while conducting research for Main Kuch Bhi Kar Sakti Hu, our serial, we found that women and men were both ready for a change, but were held back by fears around changing social norms. But challenging social norms led to a different situation. And I want to particularly share in Bundelkhand, a very backward part of India, we found men who we had not mobilized on their own after watching the serial, mobilized themselves and went to different villages and took a vow never to practice violence against women, as well as help women and practice family planning. Now, I do believe that this is one small example, but our research showed, our evaluation showed that the communication gap between men and women after watching behavior change communication together is the increase in communication is the key to girls and boys promoting gender equality, challenging patriarchy and masculinity and norms that prevent violence against women. In addressing violence against women, we also did another program called Bas Bahut Ho Gaya, Enough is Enough. And we found, which was again ending violence, and the response we had was both programs. We found almost equal % of men and women watched the programs, and those exposed to the campaigns expressed intentions to positively address violence against women and girls in their everyday living in the first program. We all know that these entrenched norms will not change overnight. So social and behavior change programs, I say that to donors, I say that to those who are working on these issues, you have to stay the course. And unless we do that, we are not going to be able to make sustainable changes, and there'll be 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps backward. And I've seen in the violence GBV, we spend all our time maintaining the small gains that we have made. And I'd like to end by saying, with the right mix of appropriate multiple communication approaches, we can foster individual and social change, which is sustainable. And I do believe that communities are ready for a change because they have been exposed to how the better off live, the better half lives. And so we are in, this is a great time to, especially during post-COVID, for us to use the behavior change momentum, as well as people using digital technology and etc. to reach them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Poonam. That was fantastic. It's so encouraging to hear, and there's such great potential in this area for change, and change of gender norms, which are at the heart of what needs to change, as you say, for sustainability. That's fantastic. And now we're going to turn indeed to Gary Barker to hear about men and masculinities. Another aspect of change that is really important. As Poonam just said, we're not going to get anywhere if we don't take allies with us. And of course, working with men and boys is central to that. Gary, we're delighted to have you here today. Thank you very much for joining us. Gary is CEO and president of Promundo US. He's a leading global voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality and positive masculinities. And as I'm sure everyone knows, Promundo is a very successful, hugely global organization, and works in many countries around the world. Gary, what do you see as the major achievements in norm change work, particularly over the last quarter century? I think 25 years ago, there was very little. What are the major challenges moving forward?
Thanks, Carol, and thanks for the invitation, and congratulations on the launch of your report yesterday. I was pouring through it in preparation for today. First, I think it's important to say there's no single narrative in terms of changes we've seen in boys and men over the last 25 years. I think it's undeniable the impact of the women's rights movement at the grassroots level, the national level, the international level, and we do see that showing up in some men's behaviors and attitudes. I think we see some trends that urban-based, more educated, younger men in some settings show more equitable attitudes and less acceptance of violence against women, but that's in no way uniform. We see other countries where it's clear there's a backlash going on, that actually a younger generation of men thinks that the feminist movement has gone too far. We've seen data out of the UK and Denmark recently on that. Our work on the man box that we did in the UK, Mexico, US, Jamaica, Australia, finds that there's new forms of misogyny happening online, that 1/4 of young men report carrying out some kind of sexual harassment online. So I think there is no single narrative as we look at it. I think we need to look at the impact of young women feminists who have made the expression toxic masculinity, for example, ubiquitous and well-known. I think that is a fantastic success that we're now calling out harmful ideas about manhood. At the same time, we're seeing a backlash to that and lots of men threatened by even those conversations. So I think, echoing what Poonam says, I think we see a couple of steps forward, but at least 1.5 steps backwards in terms of many men threatened by a notion of a world of equality and where lots of forms of violence by men against women are questioned. So where do we go and what do we know of the program field or the attempt to change the norms and behaviors? I think we've got over 25 years a lot of excellent and evidence-based program approaches. These are not standalone with boys and men only. I think the best ones are also engaging women and girls. Some of them are in male predominant spaces, so military or sports or male segregated workplaces, where they may focus on men, but I think the best of our programming really is men and women together. I think the biggest challenge with it is that it's been mostly small scale program work. Important and often important scale even in the settings that it's working, but I think our biggest challenge is how to take it out of its program boxes and really to think about not just scaling out, but scaling in. By that I mean, how do we look at the education sector, the health sector, social protection programs, some of these governmental, sometimes they're non-governmental, that have the opportunity to reach not only huge numbers, but also to change institutional norms. We've been working a lot to try to do that in recent years. How do we give our programming away so it becomes not an add-on to the school system, for example, but becomes part of teacher training, work that we've been doing in a few countries? Or how do we build this into early childhood programming, as we're trying to do in Brazil with Brazil's national home visitation program called Criança Feliz? How do we train the home visitors and the wraparound community workers to feel like they own programming around parent training that includes fathers? How do we look at the health sector? We've also worked in Brazil with the National Women's Health Program and Maternal and Child Health Program to build a protocol around men's visits during a prenatal visit and ways that we engage them both to screen for violence, but also to nudge men toward being more active in the care of their child and the household and the health of their households. We've been working in Colombia with Colombia's national social protection program, Familias en Acción, which reaches 1 in 4 Colombian households and probably one of the largest national social protection programs, to say, how can we take the women-focused social protection program, not change what's working there, but add on to the services that are there to engage men, both around doing more of the unpaid care work at home, as well as using it as a place to do violence prevention. I think the work around fatherhood and engaging men and doing half of the care work is also part of it. Some of our research and many others have found that where men are more involved in the hands-on care of children, we tend to see less violence. I think that's an issue where we help men see their stake, not only in the prevention of violence, but also in the well-being overall of their families. Fourth point, I think, if I counted those right, a fourth point would be around trauma-informed approaches. And certainly Rachel's research and lots of other research we find is that many men's use of violence is not only driven by norms, it is also often driven in part by their witnessing and experience of violence during childhood. We find that men who witness violence growing up are 3 times more likely to carry it out against a female partner as adults. That's not an excuse for their violence. That tells us we also need to look at the trauma component of men's use of violence, and of course what that means in women's lives as well. We're testing some approaches in DRC and also some work in the US with younger, both with adults and with youth, on how a trauma-informed approach can reduce these intergenerational cycles of violence. I also think we need to think about de-escalating and political de-escalation of the angry internet. There's a lot of misogynist ideas that are propagating on the internet that seems to be gaining in strength, that shifted and determined election outcomes in my 2 home countries of the US and Brazil. I think we need some more creative work there. And I'm getting to my final 20 seconds. I would say, how do we take this to earlier ages? A lot of what we know of patterns of norms and certainly the internalization of harmful ideas about manhood, we know start in earlier childhood. We've just launched with Plan International and the Caring Foundation, the Global Boyhood Initiative, looking at how do we take these ideas to at younger ages, to those who care and raise boys, where these norms start even earlier. So see all of that as ways forward, and I look forward to engaging more in the conversation. Thank you.
Gary, thanks very much. Just illustrating all the different fronts on which we work in order to address gender-based violence, and also scaling up, which was certainly featured in the report we published yesterday as being very important. So for the last 5 minutes, I'm going to turn to Laurie Michau. She is the co-founder and director of Raising Voices, which is a feminist non-profit organization based in Kampala in Uganda, working to prevent violence against women and children. Laurie is a very inspirational leader. I've worked with her before and always enjoy listening to her. She has worked and spearheaded with the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Network, which has over 1,000 members in the Horn, East and Southern Africa. So Laurie, we want to hear from you about community mobilization and creating the sort of social norm change that's necessary to prevent violence.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And it's so lovely to be here. I really appreciate being included in this discussion today. So post-Beijing, we have come a long way since then. Very many challenges, of course, remain, but on the issue of violence against women, real progress has been made. I think if we look back in the 90s, activists across the global South really started responding to and addressing violence against women. There was so much passion and commitment, and really critical strides were made in ensuring violence against women was recognized as a human rights violation. But in terms of how to prevent it, we still had so much to learn. At that time, we really did think it would take generations to reduce women's experience of violence. We thought that focusing on individual women experiencing violence would create change. We also thought that information or just legal frameworks alone would stop the violence. And now 25 years later, we know so much more. We have decades of practice-based learning and learning from a variety of very rigorous research studies, and we're well positioned to really make progress in ending violence against women and girls. I think the single most important change since Beijing is that we know that violence is preventable. It doesn't take the generations as we assumed, and this is great, amazing news. Real progress can happen. Preventing violence is possible. It takes efforts and actions at multiple levels, thinking about scale, from policy and legislative frameworks that uphold norms to the institutions that communities rely on for critical services and information, and how women and men as people think and feel about violence, women, and equality. It really takes social change. And one of the most powerful tools that we feel really allows us to make change is community mobilization, which is what I was asked to speak about today. It's a powerful strategy for creating social change at every level. And from the learning and programming over the last decades, we know it holds considerable promise and possibility in ending violence. Community mobilization, which is sometimes called community activism, is a whole community approach that seeks to engage and create change at every level through the ecological model at the individual, relational, community, and society. It does work, as Poonam is saying, it works with both women and men, not just women who are affected by violence or men who are using violence, but a real cross-section of community members to shift those social norms that allow violence to happen. The evidence and practice-based learning over the last 25 years show that they're really essential elements that are like a bit like secret sauce to violence prevention. First, a gender power or feminist analysis. This is really critical for addressing the core driver of violence against women, which is gender equality. So for example, in programming, this really requires reflecting on typical power dynamics between women and men, starting from one's own position and positionality and lived experience to a systemic analysis of how violence is sustained in the broader society. Second, we need to adjust gender equality moving beyond just information sharing, again, as Poonam was saying, to meaningfully foster critical analysis and reflection. This really requires getting personal with people, so people have the opportunity and even feel some social pressure to consider how violence against women hurts each of us, our families, women generally, men, children, and the broader community. Third, while getting personal, we really need to help people feel a sense of hope and possibility, that focusing on the benefits of change rather than focusing on the problem really can fuel and sustain positive change and really work to diminish the harmful backlash, which is global and across in so many, and I would say probably every community. Fourth, people change people. That's really what we know. Those we trust in our personal lives, those we rely on in our communities, those we see daily. Change is relational. It happens and is sustained collectively. Fifth, it takes time and intensity. It isn't one conversation, one friend who's reflecting these ideas, but many people in their diverse roles over time to support new ideas. And finally, it requires structural change, the institutions and policies that shape and also reflect back a community's social norms and values. This isn't done by one project. Yeah, it isn't done by one organization. Projects and organizations can support and guide change, but this is instead done by mobilizing whole communities. It takes building a spirit of activism by individuals, groups, and organizations and institutions together and independently to believe in their hearts that violence hurts all of us and that we feel compelled by our values to create change. And this is real movement building. This is what can prevent violence against women and what can sustain it. And we have the opportunity to support transformative work, to challenge ourselves, to move beyond our own project mindsets, to think more expansively, more independently and interdependently, to create inclusive, people first, more feminist, politicized work that can prevent violence against women. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Laurie. That your passion is always shining whenever you speak, and we really appreciate your interventions. So panel, thank you all very much.